Alright, so for today's video, I'm just going to go over the basics of a conversion and how I'm going to do my conversion just in a very general sense and not get into any of the specifics or the more complicated technical stuff, just the very basic overview of the parts and of the wiring. So obviously the first part you need is a motor. That can be an AC or a DC motor. And with that motor you'll need an inverter or a controller. So for an AC motor, it's both an inverter and a controller that you need. They're generally packaged as one unit. The inverter is what takes the DC voltage from the battery and converts it to three-phase AC for your typical AC motor. And the controller controls the frequency of that AC current. And for a DC motor, it's just called a controller. There's no inverter necessary, and it controls the amperage. And so the next part you'll need is a charger. This is how you charge your battery, your main traction pack. It's called your battery pack. And this takes AC current from a wall socket, whether it's 110 or 220, and it converts it to the appropriate DC voltage. So for my conversion it'll be around 100 volts. You also need a DC to DC converter, and what this does is it steps down the voltage from the voltage of your main battery pack to what's needed for the 12 volt system. So usually it'll put out around 13 or 14 volts to keep 12 volt charged, and that 12 volt in a conversion generally stays the same. So you have your headlights and all of those headlights, stereo, everything like that stays the same with the conversion. Of course, you also need the battery pack. Yeah, this is the pack that powers the drivetrain. It's a high capacity, high voltage generally. And for that battery pack, you need something called a battery management system. And what this system does is it makes sure that the cells are balanced, and it makes sure that none of them get out of balance. It controls charging to make sure that they don't get overcharged or over discharged. With lithium batteries, if you over discharge them past a certain point, they can never be charged again, and they're essentially worthless. And with overcharging, that's how you end up in a situation where it could turn into a thermal runaway, where a fire can start, and that is obviously something you want to avoid. So for AC and DC, one of the big advantages of an AC motor is that you get regenerative braking. So if you've ever driven an electric car, most of them have on by default a setting where you can essentially use the car using just the accelerator pedal. So when you let off of it, it starts regenerating, and that recharges the battery but also slows you down. So it saves wear on the brakes and the brake pads. And it also allows you to go further on a little bit further on a single charge. And generally, AC motors are more powerful, especially over longer periods of time. But a big downside of AC motors is that they are significantly more expensive. As for DC motors, they're more efficient because you're not converting the power from DC to AC, but you don't get any regenerative braking. And in the most common types of DC motors that are used in a conversion, there are brushes that are required, and those need to be swapped out fairly often. So that's routine maintenance that you just don't have on an AC motor. So for this conversion, I'm going to be using the Hyper 9 motor. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. One of them is that it's very easy to program. It's a simple motor. It's essentially a kit. It also has an inverter included. And the mounting face is a standard mounting face, which will allow me to adapt it to the transmission, which I'll talk about in the next slide. It's pretty lightweight, and it's a pretty small motor, waterproof, water resistant. It only weighs around 120 pounds, and peak efficiency is around 95%, I believe, which is pretty good for an AC motor. And you can see that on the side here is the controller on the right. So that is what takes the DC You can see if you can see the small B's. Let me turn on the pointer here. You can see the B minus, I believe, and B plus. That's where you connect your battery inputs, and then these are the three phases of AC power that run from here to these three terminals on the motor, and that's how you power your three-phase AC motor. So what you also would need, in my conversion at least, is an adapter plate. What this does is it takes the motor and it connects it to the transmission. And so the reason why I'm reusing the transmission is because one, it's easier than having to redesign a whole front end of the car, essentially a whole new drive axles and half shafts and all of that. And I get to have the ability to select a gear ratio. So with a manual transmission, there's gear reductions anywhere from a typical one. First gear will be like a 10-to-1 gear reduction. So for every 10 rotations of the input shaft, it spins once on the output shaft, and that gives you more torque. And fifth gear, the highest gear, is generally a 1-to-1, where every rotation on the input shaft is one rotation on the output shaft. And that gives you the ability to travel faster, like for highway speeds. So the general rule of thumb is that you need twice as much of a motor for a direct drive system that doesn't use a transmission than you would for one that does use a transmission. So that's an important thing to note when deciding on a motor and a drive system. There are no factory EVs that you can buy that have that are attached to a transmission that you can shift. The only exception to this is the Porsche Taycan, which has a 2-speed transmission that shifts around 70 miles an hour, I believe. But you can't change when it shifts, and that's a big disadvantage, because you need a much more powerful motor for it to be able to perform both off the line quickly and to maintain highway speeds while still being efficient through that whole range. So you can get by with a much less powerful motor. The Netgain motor is only around 120, rated for around 120 horsepower. Of course, that's an electric motor. It'll feel a lot more powerful than that. Alright, so moving on to the charger. For mine, I'm going to be using a 6.6 kilowatt Elcon charger. The output voltage is 108 volts nominal, and it can accept anywhere from, I believe, 100 volts to 265 or so of AC current, AC voltage from the wall. So that allows you to get on a 240 volt plug with the J1772 connector, that allows you to get the full 6.6 kilowatts. And it should be enough. With 6.6 kilowatts, I'll be able to fully charge the 50 kilowatt hour pack in around 8 or 9 hours, which is good enough. And also from Elcon, I'm getting the 1 kilowatt DC to DC converter. It's a good price, 1,000 watts, 1 kilowatt. It should be enough to charge up the 12 volt battery and then some. So it's a solid choice for my conversion. And then for batteries, I'm going with 10 Tesla Model S modules. So these are salvaged modules pulled out of generally wrecked Teslas, and they're very, very valuable because they're the most energy dense, most powerful batteries you can get. New or used, they're still the best. Yeah, so 10 of those, they're 5.3 kilowatt hours each, 24 volts. 10 of those will give me 53 kilowatt hours, and with the degradation from them being used, probably around 50 kilowatt hours. And I'm thinking that that'll get me somewhere around 150 miles of range, maybe 170, maybe 130, but somewhere between 120 or so and 200. And this is a very basic wiring diagram. So you can see the charger up here. So this is the I just realized this graph is a little bit wrong. You can ignore this here. So this is, oh wait, never mind, it is right. So this is the wall charger. This plugs directly into your outlet, And then that, with the cable, plugs into the charge port, which is on the car. That charge port is wired to the charger, which goes directly to the traction pack to charge it, the main battery pack. And this traction pack is monitored by the BMS. The BMS will communicate with the charger and the motor controller and everything, but I for simplicity's sake, I just connected it to the traction pack because it balances the traction pack, balances and keeps it in safe and good operating conditions. And then also running off the traction pack is, of course, the motor, controller, and the inverter, and then that connects directly to the motor, which goes to the wheels. And then also to run the 12-volt system, the traction pack needs to connect to the DC to DC converter, which then charges the 12-volt battery. And that's a pretty basic overview of the conversion. I'll be publishing some more videos more in depth. I'm just starting to order some of the first parts, so hopefully this conversion will get started soon.